I'm sorry for the confusion and the delay with the technology. Seems to start every shiur off with the same introduction. So the Gemara says, Kosev UMochek, Tanu Rabbanon, Kosev ois achas gedola, v'yesh b'mkom lichtov shtayim potter, mochak ois gedola v'yesh b'mkom lichtov shtayim chayv. So Gemara, the Brisa teaches us two dinim, that if one wrote an ois gedola, even though there's a mokum lichtov shtayim on potter, and if one was mochek ois gedola, even though which is in a mokum lichtov shtayim, then one is chayiv for the mechika. So first of all, the reason one is potter for Kosev ois achas gedola, Rashi says, is because we learn dumya de Mishkan, that in the Mishkan the ksiva that took place was shtei oisius. Rashi says the scenario was that he used to write letters on the kroshim in order to match up the kroshim, so you would write aleph aleph base base or something like that on the kroshim. And since the melachot in the Mishkan was two oisius, therefore you're only chayav for writing two oisius. In other words, in the Mishkan they wrote many oisius because they had many kroshim which they lined up. But it seems the point is there was only an outcome, a tangible outcome in the Mishkan, which was two oisius, and therefore the minimum chashivus of a ksav that's relevant to Masechet Shabbat is two oisius. In other words, this is a shiur, like all the shiurim that we have in melachos. Every melacha has a shiur. A shiur is always a halacha Moshe Sinai of sorts, meaning a shiur is one has to draw a line somewhere, and a shiur is a cut-off point where one draws the line. So if you eat a mouthful, crumb, that's a degree of eating. You eat 2 crumbs, it's a further degree of eating. 3 crumbs, it's further. And at some point, there's enough has been eaten that it has a significance. How enough is enough? There's no svara over here. There's no rationale that can tell you where the cutoff point is. It's just that it's a tipping point. You do more and more till it has till it's significant enough. And therefore, the shiur halacha Moshe Sinai is a kazayis for achila, let's say. So similarly, I don't know, with a mechitza. So if you have a barrier that's 5 tefachim high, it creates somewhat of a barrier. If it's 8 tefachim high, it's more of a barrier. If it's 15 tefachim high, it's more of a barrier. If it's 20 tefachim high, it's yet more. So you have to there has to be a cutoff point, at which point is it enough of a barrier to be significant to act as a mechitza. And for that, again, there's the shiur of 10 tefachim. So I think a similar sort of rationale over here. If the melachot of kasiva, of Kosev, is conveying information, it carries information. So 1 letter carries some information, 5 letters carries more information. The shiur that we learn from the Halacha Moshe Sinai the shiur that we learn from the Halacha Moshe Sinai the shiur that we learn from the Mishkan is that 2 oisius is enough for it to be the melacha of Kosev. That's what appears to be the pshat in Rashi and this shiur. Not that I know of, and that was one of the reasons why I printed the Mishnah. The only one where the shiur seems to be listed is Tofa Shtei Tfiras and Kosev Shtei Shtei Batanirin Shtei Oisius. It's not clear why the Mishnah lists it. We suggested with Tfira that maybe the reason it's listed is because it only really becomes effectively a stitch when it has an in and out twice. Similarly, maybe with Kosev, you could argue that 1 letter doesn't convey information, 2 letters do. It's also clear cut. I mean, a word of 1 letter conveys information. In English, the letter A is a word, so it's not clear cut why the shiur should be. I'm hesitating because I'm getting messages from my computer that it's going to shut down in 11 minutes. So if my computer does cut off, I'll restart on my phone, and I'll have to manage Zoom like that. So I apologise to everyone who's listening via the. Yeah. So it could be because it could be. I don't know why the Mishnah is a shiur. We discussed it with Tofa, and it could be that. Yes, yeah. No, it's not clear cut. There's in the prokim, in the continuation of Masechet Shabbat, there's whole chapters that deal with the concept of shiurim for all the melachos. So it's not clear cut at all what which ones are listed and which ones not. In practice, though, the Gemara seems to understand that they used a letter, and a letter conveys more information than just a blob. But you're correct. I mean, if the melachot of Kosev is writing that conveys information, then a number would also be a letter from that point of view. A number is really a type of letter. I mean, we distinguish between numbers and letters, but they are both symbols that carry content, and therefore, similarly, a sketch would also be a symbol that carries content, and therefore that would be enough. So, at what point a sketch goes from just being a vague shape to being a symbol that carries content isn't entirely clear. The post can discuss whether it's only a symbol written on a background or not. So if I sculpture a symbol, would that also be forming a symbol that conveys information, and therefore enough for the melacha of Kosev? But the point of Kosev is that it carries information. In other words, it has the Ksav has its own independent significance, rather than just decorating the surface upon which it rests. So the difference between Seveya, the melachot of Seveya, which is dyeing, and the melacha of Kosev is that by dyeing, the whole point is that the background is enhanced by the dye. So if you paint a wall or you dye a cloth, that's the melacha of, or color a utensil, that's the melacha of Seveya, because the color that you're adding, the ink that you're adding, is there to enhance the cloth upon which it rests. Whereas with a picture or letters that you write, the chashivas of the melacha, the significance of the ink added to the fabric upon which it sits, is the ink, is the shape itself, the lettering itself, the picture itself, and the information it conveys. So carrying and communicating information through something written, that's the melacha. Nonetheless, it has to have the chashivas of being something that intrinsically carries information, as opposed to just something that to me carries information. So to me, I may know that a blob matches something up, but since it's not a letter, it doesn't carry intrinsic information. What does it mean carries intrinsic information? That there's a group of people who have agreed that this symbol carries information, and rather than just to me, because blob plus blob matches up, that something like that would be the criteria. I mean, you'd have interesting questions about newly formed languages or languages which are going extinct. At what point does a letter cease to be a letter and just become a random squiggle? That I may have a squiggle that conveys information to me, but it may not be Kosev because it doesn't carry information. So it's how many users of the language do you need for it to carry information and still be considered information? Yeah, so as far as I know, unresolved questions.
In the case of the Prussian, though, it just needs to be identical rather than of any.
In principle, it could have been enough, but that wasn't how they did it. They did Osius. Somehow or other, the Gemara understands they used letters, and therefore the melachot of Kosev is only when there's lettering. In other words, where it carries intrinsic information, rather than just to an individual practitioner, you know that this is what the squiggle represents. The chashivas of Roshim is also there. It carries information. It carries information in another form. We'll get to Roshim, but the point of Roshim also is that it carries information. It's acting as a marker or a highlighter or an indicator of place or something of the sort. It has to again carry some level of. Okay, apologies. Sorry, apologies. So I was just being asked about Roshim, and I was explaining that Roshim is a tolda of Kosev, and the reason it's a tolda is because it conveys information, albeit not in letter form. And at what point does a squiggle become a letter? I'm not sure. That remains unresolved. How many users of a language do you need for the squiggle to have the chashivas of a letter? But the reason why Roshim is a tolda of Kosev is because it is because it conveys information, and that's what makes it the tolda. I think that's what I was saying before I got cut off, and apologies for that delay. Okay, so that's the melacha of Kosev, and the reason why you need a chashivas of two letters is because that's a share in how much information is conveyed to make it a melacha, and that's the reason why the Brisa says that Isachas Kedola is not the melacha, it's not the share of the melacha, because the size of the letter is irrelevant. The chashivas of the letter or two letters isn't in its size, but is in that it's two letters. And therefore one letter, however large it is, doesn't add to the chashivas of the letter with respect to the melacha of Kosev. and therefore it isn't the melacha. There could be scenarios. This is the Rishonim, some of the Rishonim I printed in the sources and the Mishnah references. There could be scenarios where one letter has enough chashivas. So where it's the last letter in a book, where you're completing a book with that. As we saw the Meiri also when we looked at Makam Patish references, in completing a sefer, then that would have the chashivas of the melachot of Kosev, even though it's only one letter, because it's completing everything else that's been written. So you need some degree of chashivas in order for it to have convey enough information or carry enough information to be the melacha. And once you've got two osios, you've created two osios, that would be the melacha of Kosev, and if one os doesn't do it. It's possible another way of understanding the two osios is that Kosev is a bit like boina. It's attaching parts together to make the melacha, and therefore when you have two osios, they are the two bricks in the building, which is the melacha of Kosev. It could be that the reason why one os normally isn't enough is because even though it carries information, and indeed in English, for example, there are words which are one letter, nonetheless, the melacha of Kosev is putting together osios, and therefore it's only when you have a minimum of two osios that you've done the melacha. If that's the explanation, then it wouldn't so much be a shiur as a sort of definition of the melacha. It's not just the measure of the melacha, but a definition of the melacha, that the combination of putting two letters together is like two bricks in the building that together form a more complex entity, and therefore that's that would be the chashivas of the melacha. Either way, for that reason, os achas gadol is not the melacha, because the size of the os is irrelevant.
How do you know that the Av is not Roshem, and it's like sort of like Natilat Neshama was with Hashochto, where Hashochto is just brought in the Mishnah as a kind of classic example, in the same way that perhaps Kotev would be with Roshem. Where do you see that it's...
I only see that in Rashi, because Rashi says that the parent example is what took place in the Mishkan, which is where they wrote two osios on the Rosh Kroshim in the construction of the Mishkan, and therefore Rashi says that's where we see that it's the melacha. So if we ask ourselves, where was the melacha in the Mishkan? Rashi answered the question. The melacha in the Mishkan was the writing of two osios on the Rosh Kroshim. Let's actually just have a look at Rashi on the Mishnah. Since you're asking, what does Rashi in the Mishnah say? So Rashi in the Mishnah says the same thing. He says, where do we find it in the Mishkan? And he says, he uses the word Roshim, but look how he explains it. Al Kroshim Mishkan later is event Zukai. The Kosev Ois Bezu, for Ois Bezu, Mochek Parmim Shatai, it's actually because Mochek is where Parmim making a mistake. But the place where it comes in the Mishnah is that they used to write an oath on the Kroshim. Where Chazal knew from that they used to write an oath, I don't know. Maybe they used to just use a blob, as he said, and use the symbol. And I'm not sure, but Al Kolponim, Chazal understood that the way they marked the Kroshim was by writing osios, letters, and therefore the Av Menach is Kosev is writing letters.
Have to do it right from one end, but to keep Av Menach perfect, Roshim. Well, this is exactly what Hebrew style. It has to be worded.
So, Paul, where's your thing from?
I don't know, but
As far as I remember, the Tanakama here is arguing with Rabbi Yossi, but I need to see the Gemara again and see how that plays out. I need to double check what the Gemara is saying again. As far as I remember, that was the Machlokas in the Mishnah. That's good for the Machlokas in the Mishnah. So for those who are online, I was just being asked about the other Maramakim I printed, the Gemara in Kuf Gimel Amud Aleph, where Rabbi Yossi says Lo Yichiv Shtei Otis Ela Mishum Roshim, But as far as I understand, the Tanakama holds that the melachah is not because of Roshem, and the melachah is because of Kosev. It is true that the kashivas of what they needed to do in the Mishkan was in order to link the Hiroshim, as Rashi, according to Rashi at least, as Rashi explains. Nonetheless, the way they did that, somehow Chazal understood was using Osius, and therefore you need Osius for the Melacha. It's reasonable that there would be a Tolda which is without Osius, because the point of it is the Roshem. But the way they did it was with Kosev. Even Rabbi Yossi seems to understand that they used Osius in the Mishkan. He says the Chashivas is not the Osius, the Chashivas is simply the symbol in it, and therefore it makes no difference whether it's an Os or not. But even Rabbi Yossi seems to agree they used Osius. Why, where Chazal got from that they used Osius, I don't know. Even Rabbi Yossi seems to say they used Osius, just the significance was not the Osius. I don't think they're still connected. I don't think so. No. He was told that's the Av, yes. Yeah. Well, to be honest, I look again at this again at the Gemara. So let me, as gracefully as possible, backpedal from committing myself too much. And I need to learn the Gemara there again and double check. Yeah. Okay, so that's the Malacha of Kosev. Then we have the Malacha of Mochek. So there's really the Roshei Parakim of what we need to think about as we consider Mochek is what is the essence of the Malacha of Mochek, and what is the relationship between the Malacha of Mochek and the intention to write something new. And here again, I printed in the source sheets just a reminder of the Mishnah in Ein Gimel and Beis, in which the Mishnah talks about several examples of paired malachas, where one malacha unravels the other malacha quite literally, like kosher and mate and knotting and unknotting, or tofa and korea, sewing and tearing, or bona and sosa, building and dismantling, or mechaber and mave, lighting and extinguishing. And one of those types of malachas of the malacha and its twin, which undoes the malacha, is Kosev and Mochek. Now Tosas already raises the question of why with some of the malachas does it say korea or manas litzfo. In other words, the destructive malacha has to be on the condition of redoing the malacha, and in other cases it doesn't bother mentioning it. Now, there are two possible stories of why the Mishnah says that you need the almanas in the negative malacha. Svara number one would be that's the description or the definition of the malacha. And we discussed this, by the way, many times in the Shiur. We discussed it when we learned Korea, we discussed it when we learned Mate. In each case, we really ask the same question. Is the pshat that you need the almanas, let's say Korea almanas litzvah, is that the definition of the malacha? The malacha isn't really Korea. There's no malacha of Korea. There's a malacha of the whole sidura. There's a whole order of malachas which gets you to the point of sewing. And then there's a particular action that people do when you've mis-sewed and you need to prepare for sewing, and that's unstitching. But the chashivas of the malacha of unstitching is as a preparation, as a preparatory malacha for restitching. So the definition of the malacha is that it's a preparation for restitching. That's model number one. It's the definition of the malacha. Model number two is no. The malacha is korea. Just every malacha has to be positive, not mekalkel, not destructive. A malacha is a constructive, not a destructive act. And korea is simply an example of a constructive outcome to korea, because korea is normally fundamentally destructive, and it's only almanas litzvah which makes it constructive. But if you could dream up another form of constructive reason for korea, then anochanami, that would also be the malacha. So this is the shayla that we've asked again and again every time we met an almanas. Sorry? Yes, yeah. Now, in Lulei Divrei Tosas, it wasn't for Tosas, we could have perhaps said that this was the pshat and why the Mishnah sometimes says almanas and sometimes not. But the Mishnah lists the Amatas Malachas. That's the task of our Mishnah on Ein Gimel Amadalef. The task of the Mishnah is not to give me all the halachas of how to do malachas. It doesn't mention on condition you don't do it with the shinoi, and on condition that you have intention, and on condition that you do it, or it's not Dava Shein and it's covered, and on condition it's not mitasi. The Mishnah is listing the malachas. So why does the Mishnah list almanas? If almanas is just to avoid it in the kalkel, then it's a little bit difficult why the Mishnah lists it. That's another halacha when you do lamed tes melachos. So you want us to be constructive, not destructive. So why does the Mishnah list it? It's just a background halacha. When you do the first lamed melachos, make sure they're not misafik. You're not chayiv if it's misafik. You're not chayiv if it's for the shinoi. Shaloi kaderech. If you're not chayiv if it's eina miskavin, and you're not chayiv if it's destructive rather than constructive. So why does the Mishnah mention the almanas? Whereas if it's part of the definition of melacha, then we understand why the Mishnah mentions the almanas, because it's definitional, it's part of the description of the melacha. So we could have thought to answer Tosa's question like that the almanas is when it's the definition of the melacha. Equally though, we could say stop being so pedantic about the language in the Mishnah. Maybe it's true that the only reason the Mishnah says almanas is avoidance of mekalkel, and the Mishnah lists it because that's a question that would spring to mind immediately. Tearing is a malacha. What do you mean tearing is a malacha? It's mekalkel. No, there's a tearing that's positive. Almanas litva, where your career almanas litva. So Mishnah is coming to just mention that there is a positive, and it's simply giving an example of a positive version of the malacha, and who are doing other versions of the malacha would be enough. And this remains an unresolved wound in the Mishnah. I mean, it's something that we haven't arrived at a clear answer to. Each sugya we've looked at it anew and seen different views and different ways of understanding and what the core part of the malacha is. If you remember, there was a Tosis on Ein Gimel Amud Aleph, which I reprinted in the source sheets. There's a Tosis on Ein Gimel Amud Beis, who talks about this issue, and a Rabbi Kiva Eger who argues on it. And look in Tosis doing a master with Tzorich Le'etzim on Ein Gimel Amud Beis. For those who were there when we did this, you can look into Chazar on that. There's a Rabbi Kiva Eger footnote on it who says that who Gufa picks a fight with Tosis over this. And I mentioned there Biur Halacha, who discusses this issue about whether this is part of the definition of the Melacha or whether this is just an incidental avoidance of the problem of Mekalkel. And therefore I'm simply going to say for now, in terms of agenda setting for what we want to achieve in the Shiur, it would be nice to know in Mochek what evidence we can harness either way about whether the Almanas Lichtov is part of the essence of the Melacha or it's dealing with a side problem of Mekalkel. So that's the second agenda that we have in the Sugya. And the third agenda that we have in the Sugya is it would be nice to know what is the essence of, it's really a continuation of the second agenda, what is the essence of the Melach of Mochek? Is the essence of the Melach of Mochek removing Kosev? Writing, as we said already, is a choshev thing. It conveys information. The Melach of Kosev or Roshem, I'm not going into the debate about Kosev or Roshem, but the concept of the Melach is that I have a symbol which conveys information. It's a weighty thing. Letters, communication, human communication, is a weighty thing. It carries content. And the Melach of Mochek is destruction of content. That would be one model for the Melacha. And the alternative Melacha for the model would be, no, this is a hachana for writing. There's a whole series of melachos about that are parchment preparation, preparing material to be written on. And Mochek is another type of preparation material. Sometimes you have wrong kasav on a material, and your Mochek is in order to reuse that material, and therefore it's part of the preparatory melachos for the melacha of Kosev. So this is a sort of continuation of the previous shaila. So if you like, we'll label it as its own question. What is the definition of the melacha of Kosev? Is the melacha of Kosev removal of a letter or a sign, the chashivas that conveys information, of Mochek, is the melacha of Mochek removal of information, or is the melacha of Mochek preparation for Kosev? Now, I'll finish with this because we've run out of time. The crowbar that we will use to crack this open is the diuk that the Rishonim make in the Gemara, and most emphatically expressed by the Shittel. If you remember, the history of the Shittel is it was a Rishon that was ascribed to the Rashba. Certainly came to the base from the base of Medrash of the Rashba, then it was later ascribed to the Ran, it's Miyuchas Ran. We don't know exactly who wrote it, but it's from the family tree of Rishonim in the base of Medrash of the Ran and the Rashba. And the diuk that he launches himself from is, why does it say Mochek Ois Gedolah? It's someone who's Mochak a large Ois, Almanach Lichtov Shtei Oises. Why doesn't it say Mochak Ois, where there's enough space to write two Oises? Any size Ois, you can write a smaller Ois there in its place. So the Ram considers a very strong diuk, and therefore goes into his whole discussion about which letters you're replacing it with. Mitzvah Hashem on Sunday. We will we'll look at that. We'll look at the Ram and the Rosh and the Rambam and start trying to analyze what is the essence and the Biur Halacha, what is the essence of the Melacha of Mochek. But for today, we'll stop there and I apologize again about the technological problems today. Wish everyone a good evening.
Thank you.